It's another Manly Monday, and this Manly Monday we are talking about what it means to be a man. What is a man? How do you become a man? And a lot of people think defining man is easy. There's a simple dictionary definition for it, right? The reality, it isn't, because like anything tied to humans, there is a textual or a denotative element of the thing. And then there is a contextual or connotative element of the thing. And the denotative element or the textual element is the simple part, but it's often about 10% of the actual meaning with anything involving humans. The connotative, the contextual element is very, very complicated. And it's 90% of our experience. Obviously, these are not empirical. It's just, phenomenal cosmic power, itty bitty living space. If you like this sort of analysis, help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it, coffee.com/Leanna K. Once again, Manly Mondays are at high risk of demonetization in the wake of the Johnny Depp Amber Heard thing. It's still going on. I am going to talk about what I want to talk about. I am not worrying about monetization, so any support you can give is greatly appreciated. Because background on me for those of you who are new, I was in gender studies and anthropology courses in university. Then I ran away to join the circus, meaning I got a job in television. I did run with a carny for a season, but that's another story. But I took the things that I was taught in gender studies and tried to apply it to the TV show I was working on. And I realized very quickly that stuff like the male gaze don't really work in field conditions. A lot of the theoretical frameworks that are used to talk about gender fall apart in the light of day when exposed to ground truths. Hence began my journey with this stuff. And obviously I came at it from the perspective of the female sphere. And you guys know I was very hesitant to tackle men's issues, because the first few times I waded in, it was not pleasant. I got pretty badly attacked and pretty badly smeared. I guess it's one of those things where either times changed, appetites changed, or, there's sort of a level up that I got to the point that people sort of knew me and trusted me. And so it went better this time. But it's really interesting doing both anthropology, which always clicked with me better than sociology, but doing anthropology and then doing the, gender study stuff, because gender studies is what they call an interdisciplinary program. And that means it takes bits and bytes from anthropology, sociology, history, fine arts, any discipline under the sun, mushes it all together on a topic of interest, not sort of a modality of exploration, if you will. And that's where you get gender studies and African American studies and Latin American studies and so on and so forth. So obviously the first thing you might be thinking right now is, isn't this prone to cherry picking? Yes. Simple answer. And that's why I tend to root the stuff I do more in an anthropological framework than a gender studies framework, which is why I get radically different results than a lot of people who cover these topics. And in anthropology, you look at different states of being, gender, family structure, social role, and so on and so forth. And it's all examined through what does this classification, what do these groups, these types, these identifiers do for the culture that uses them? And this is where I clash with people who think defining what is a man or what is a woman is as simple as adult human male, adult human female. Because you guys know, I, keep kosher and all that stuff. I'm very connected to Jewish tradition. We have the idea of a bar mitzvah, and now there's the bat mitzvah, but that just because all teenagers want to party kind of thing. The bar mitzvah is required. The bat mitzvah is not, in terms of being a full-fledged functional member of Jewish society. And the bar mitzvah is the moment that you are a man in the Jewish tradition. Now, that doesn't mean you're an adult. It means that you carry the weight of your transgressions, not your parents. The Jewish faith determines that around 13, you can start making your own decisions. You know right from wrong. It certainly doesn't mean you're a fully formed adult, but that's the beginning, right? And then there's, additional responsibilities once you get out of school and take on a trade. Parents are expected to provide their children with trades, notably sons. Then there's marriage. There are these life cycle rites of passage that sort of subdivide existence in a more gradual way than we do now, which is boom, you're 18. Okay, we have the driving age at 16, though here it's graduated. And then 18, you're considered age of majority, mean you can serve in the military and vote. And then you've got drinking ages, which here is 19. In the US, it's 21. Even then, the benchmark for adult, it's incremental, right? It's gradual. So do we define adult by when you can drive? Driving is used to be a very important rite of passage, getting your driver's license, but a lot of younger people just aren't driving for various reasons, and so that's not there. Is it when you graduate college? What if you don't go to college, right? Is it when you, get married, where our female prefixes of, Miss and Mrs. certainly suggest that there's a change that happens in a woman's status. Back in the day, you started wearing your hair up when you got married. There were markers that way. The prefix Ms. came in because there is no male equivalent to Miss and Mrs. It's just Mr., right? And a lot of women during second wave feminism were like, why am I announcing my marital status? Men don't. That's weird, right? So we have this segmented mix of stuff just in gendered adulthood. And hopefully you can already see it's not so simple to just go, a man is an adult human male. And that's before we get to the things like the 3/5 compromise. Historically, the 3/5 compromise in the founding of America, where a black man was only considered 3/5 a white man. So human at some point was 3/5 human or completely human. You see how complicated this gets. And then you get into the whole male thing, and I'm going to focus on the anthropological stuff right now, so I'm not getting into the biological sciences element of it, because that's a whole other thing of, do you measure it in the brain? Do you measure it in chromosomes? Do you measure it in genitalia? How do you measure male? These things are not simple. When you get into the anthropological digging in of gender and gender roles, that's where I got, the system I use, which is a 5-gender theory model. The multiple indigenous groups use this model based on your role in society. And this is the thing. Anthropologically, you think about these things again as role in society, not biological science. And I don't like getting into the right or wrong of that. I like being aware that these different frameworks exist. So you've got biology, which likes to identify things, essentially. You got anthropology, which is what does it do? And then you got sociology, which, to be reductive, is sort of what does it mean? I'm a what does it do type person. And when you look at gender, masculinity, femininity, you've got the identity piece. Then you've got the expression piece. And then you've got the performance piece, right? And expression and performance, there's murkiness there. There's an interplay there. I know a lot of people who watch this stuff love testable definitions. I love testable definitions. And this is the problem with this stuff. I discovered this when I made my web series Lady Bits. I had to create a definition of sexism that was actually applicable and testable, because sexism, discrimination on the basis of sex, is essentially a tautology. It tells you nothing. What does sex mean? So... and what does discrimination mean, right? So I came up with the definition. Sexism are ideas or behaviors that create or perpetuate the dominance of one gender over other genders. Because you can actually look at a behavior. It's not just that men, women, non-binary are seen as different. It's a question of, are women considered more virtuous than men? If so, that's sexist. Are men considered more intellectual than women? Well, then that's sexist, because it suggests that one gender is dominant over other genders in some way. So men being able to vote, women not being able to vote, that's sexist, right? Women getting maternity leave, men not getting a similar type of paternity leave, that's sexist. I argue that, a year or months and months of maternity leave and 2 weeks to 6 weeks paternity leave is still a sexist system, based on my definition that you can test. There we go. And I like these sorts of systems that incorporate everything and use all the facts. And it is just a fact that if being a man were as simple as, even though marking adulthood is not simple, say it's just, okay, 18, adulthood, easy, full privileges, which isn't true. You don't get to drink at 18 in the US, right? You do in province of Quebec, up here in Canada. They streamline it more. But, even if it was just simple 18 years old, boom. And like biologically, that doesn't even track, because you reach full height at around the age of 16. You can reproduce. That's where the sort of 13 huzzah you are a man thing came from. But the brain development, puberty doesn't actually completely turn off in terms of the brain and hormone stability and everything like that until the late 20s. So even biologically, define adulthood, not so simple, right? Of course, we weren't aware of the science of all this stuff collectively when these categories were created. What we had was rites of passage, actual tests that you did, ceremonies, rituals you performed, that it was a clear movement from boyhood to manhood, or girlhood to womanhood. It was something that was performed. It was something that was expressed, not just an identity. That's how we understood gender. And in my early days in radio, the radio show I did crossed over. So, our show ended, theirs began, with a show that was two counselors who worked with men. And these were the guys that I originally heard the theory that part of the crisis of masculinity that we're facing in our culture right now is because we don't have those rites of passage that gave people surety that I'm not a boy anymore, I'm a man now. That security of identity that came with, go out in the woods and hunt your first whatever, or go survive in the wilderness for a set amount of time, or something like that. Some accomplishment that meant you earned your manhood. You weren't just, the odometer rolls over and, oh, now you're a different thing. And they made a very compelling case that formed my idea of how gender functions, again, from that anthropological perspective of what does this stuff do for a culture? It makes a lot of sense to me that having that achievement-based marker was really important, and not having that, having an erosion of these things, would cause identity issues. It makes it harder to form your sense of an individuated self when you don't have these rituals. And if we look at man and woman from that performative perspective, it actually works a lot better in terms of the charge that gender carries, right? I mean, it's easier because we know that our modern racial constructs were basically created to justify slavery and indentured servitude. I'm not going to get into that now, but go look it up. It's true. Before that, it was sort of nations and tribes and, who your people was different than the codified, it started as three classifications, two of which you can no longer say because they're inherently offensive terms. Why are they offensive terms? Because Caucasoid was the only one who was a full person, according to which was white people, right? The other two categories were essentially black people, but not that word, and then Asian people, but that wasn't the term they used either. There's a reason that we don't use those terms anymore. They are inherently derogatory because they indicated lesser status. And what was it based on? Not very much sound. It was just an excuse. Well, the same thing. The idea of, slavery is actually good for these groups of people. You're happier that way because you don't have to make decisions that cause too much stress for lesser minds. It sounds horrible, but that's what they sold. And the same thing happened with gender. Why did men have the right to vote? Well, not all men. Men who own land had the right to vote first. And men who were not landowners didn't. That didn't make a ton of sense based on the scientific theories that explained why it was bad for women to vote, because it was too stressful for women to vote. And besides, women's interests were represented by their husband's vote, and before that, their father's vote. It was far too stressful to expect women to make these choices because science said, philosophy said, they were the same thing at one point, that women were more emotional and less rational, and therefore voting was too stressful. Now, they balanced that in a complementarian worldview with the idea that men were not capable of taking care of minor children. that emotion, men lacked the capacity to emotionally nurture because of that inherent rationality, right? And so if something happened to the mother of children, even if the father was still alive, it was quite common for those children to end up in an orphanage because it wasn't proper to be just raised by the father. Hence the wicked stepmother, ugly stepsister trope in fairy tales. Get married quick so you have somebody there, and the daughter, the Cinderella type of the father, was treated like garbage by the new blended family because the stepmother favored her biological children for obvious reasons in this structure. And this is what we come from. It's undeniable, and we all know that this is garbage. And we still see tendrils of this in various social structures, right? The primary caregiver of children tends to be women. We have a complicated family court system up here in Canada, so custody isn't used. Custody is about decision making. The most common form of custody up in Canada is joint custody. But then there's who lives with the children the majority of the time, and that still tends to be the mother because it's status quo, they call it. And so whoever spent the most time with the children before the divorce gets custodial rights that way. That's fairy tale structure, right? These things go through, and that's a major issue in the men's right movement, that whole issue of custody. And this all goes back to that charge gender carries and the complementary and gender structure that informs like we came up in as peoples. And that matters because if the definitions of gender, if the definition of manhood, if the definition of womanhood was as simple as adult human male, adult human female, we wouldn't see any of those things, right? Because that's just a meat sack classification. It says nothing of interests or aptitudes or anything like that. That's where the whole thing gets complicated. And this is where we get into gender roles and gender archetypes and gender ideals and this very thorny concept of masculinity that is so difficult. Men struggle with so much, and women struggle with unfortunately in opposition a lot of the time because it is poorly defined. And if we don't accept that there is something more than adult human male going on here, we fail to understand why people struggle with this so much. Because if it's just, you hit a certain age and, you check a bunch of boxes in terms of body parts, there you are. Let's be honest, it's more complicated than that, right? Be a man, man up, grow a pair, a pair of what? It's unsaid. Real men do this, real men do that. I had an exchange on Twitter last week where this guy was arguing definitions were as simple as adult human male, adult human female. And I said, come on, you're being disingenuous here. Be honest. Real men tell the truth. And he didn't challenge the idea of real men being based on the idea of a real man being based on behavior. He just said, I am telling the truth. I am being honest. And I said, you didn't challenge me at all on the concept of a real man based on behaviors. Is because I believe in the concept. There's some cognitive dissonance right there. And this, I think, is somewhat tied to the idea of, masculinity and therefore superiority being tied to reason, rationality instead of emotion. And I think that's actually very dangerous because, one, we know that emotion is a part of good decision making. Empathy and compassion are essential to making good moral choices. That's why machine learning is so difficult. You can teach computation, you can teach logic. It's very hard to teach a machine that emotional component. And so machines tend to make some not great decisions that way. One of my favorite Twitter accounts right now is translated cats. It's pictures of cats, and they run it through an AI software to describe the photo. And sometimes it's spot on. Sometimes it just goes haywire because something about the image just, the program can't pick up on the context. And this is important because reductive definitions make people go crazy when they do not feel like they belong. They are chafing against this ideal, but the terminology that they adopt does not explain their unhappiness, their sense of inadequacy. And that's what Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was essentially about. We have these works, flawed as they were. I mean, Betty Friedan was lousy to lesbians. She eventually saw the error of her ways later in her life, but she had a very heteronormative idea of femininity. But we have that in feminist and feminine discussions. We don't have male equivalents because so much of it was assumed, so much of it was public in society, and so there wasn't a need for a guidebook. But as that's changed, as those gender role lines have blurred, we have not sufficiently had a masculine mystique written. And there is a masculine mystique. There is something to, the Brad Pitts and George Clooney's and Johnny Depp's of the world that do come down to a real combination of factors that make them ideals in some way. And I mean, those are changing rapidly as well, right? Because if you look at the idols, guys like BTS, really different aesthetic than the Brad Pitts of the world, right? Then you got the, Dwayne Johnson, Jason Momoa, Chris Hemsworth. Those, everybody goes, oh yeah, those are masculine ideals. But do we question why? I mean, what does all that muscle, what does all that meat actually do in our society now other than action movies? And, everybody else, well, guys like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are sort of ideal in their own way because of money, right? That whole provider thing. So they can carry on like a bigger asshole than the action movie stars. 'Cause money, right? And action movie stars are rich as well, but, we all know it's different. There are intangibles to the differences. Just looking at those different archetypes, obviously they are very different. And yet, there is not the same sort of effort into putting into words why this is so. And that's why I again, came up with my own definition of man and woman, which is an individual who is age of majority that is recognized to conform to masculine norms in the case of a man, or feminine norms to the case of a woman. because that definition allows shifting of those norms. Oh, sorry, signifiers, not norms, masculine or feminine signifiers. So an individual of age of majority that is recognized as conforming to masculine or feminine signifiers. That's man or woman. And that's why we have this whole non-binary category of people who, androgyny. That's what it really is about. It's about those performances. It's about those expressions. It's about those signifiers. Behaviors, roles, appearances. It's really not about identity. And that's why people whose identity doesn't match what we recognize as signifiers have such a tough go. That's why guys who are shyer, less outwardly aggressive, kinder, sweeter, less raw, that's why you guys know I love Tom Holland. That's why, because he's adorkable, right? Can we please have more of that? Please. But we do not see those guys as conforming as well with the masculine signifiers. And we can change that. Because cultural signifiers can change. A person's internal identity cannot. So, and this is why rites of passage existed. There could be a greater breadth of experience when a test was issued to basically say, okay, if you pass this test, you're seen as this role in society, and there are cultures that there were, hunters, for instance, and a small number of women actually took on that masculine gender role, hence the 5 gender theory, the 5 gender model, because there was that test that solved the problem of definition. If you could do it, awesome, you're in. Would you be looked at a little bit funny for eccentricity? Yeah, but there was a test. And that's what we don't have now. And that's going back to that. Again, not my theory. I'm trying to get back in touch with one of them so I can have them on It's Not Therapy, interview them, and let them talk about it. But I think it's solid. I'm interested in what you guys think. And, could you imagine if, hey, beating a platinum trophy in Elden Ring was an acceptable rite of passage for today you are a man, right? Because that's an achievement. And we look at college, jobs, income status, everything like that. But there's quite a bit of luck and quite a bit of familial advantage. Like where you're born indicates where you're going to end up. We need rites of passage. We need behavioral pass-fails in order to really get a working definition of this stuff. And until then, we're all going to struggle with the meaning of these roles because of that contextual, that connotative element, not the textual or denotative element. Really interested in what you guys think about this. Again, please don't just go off. I'm not the typical emotional appeals don't really work on me with this stuff. There's got to be some sense to it. Non-conforming, remember, not typical. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/Leanna K. Who knows if this is going to get demonetized? Or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for somebody who can use it but can't afford it. Coffee.com/Leanna K. This has been Manly Mondays.